In this third game, we're going to look at another game that Sergei Karjakin played in the endgame. And the game we have here is his game as black against Dmitry Tishin in the Ukrainian Under-12 Championships in 2000. And Sergei was just 10 years old again. He played another fantastic endgame to down a very strong player, rated 200 points above him, so international master level. And the way he does it is very, very mature again, because he has a slightly better knight ending, but it's still very difficult to break down the opponent. And I'm really impressed by the way he really understands the endgames. And I talked about in Chapter 1 how it's very important to understand endgame positions, how to play endgames, because they really make you better players. And it's clear that Sergei has really done his work in the endgame phase. Here we see a position where black has this very nice knight on e4, and we can compare it to the very poorly placed knight on b1. But that doesn't really give Sergei an advantage, does it? It just gives him a slightly better position. He still needs to break through white's defences. So what do we know about the endgame? You need to think about where you're going to use your king. Which side of the board do you want to play on? Does the king want to stay in the centre of the board? Does it want to go to the queen side or move to the king side? Also to consider where the pawn majorities are. So which pawns will he start moving? Because remember, pawns cannot go backwards. And that means that he needs to be very careful in this endgame not to move too many pawns forward and create weaknesses. So we start this game by white played king f3, and that's a very sensible move. Should black move this knight away or try and stabilise it by defending it? If we were to move the knight away, for example knight d6, white can now go e4. Or even, he could just bring his knight back into the game with knight d2. And that would attack the pawn on c4. I think already black has lost any advantage he had in this position. So Karjakin correctly decided, after king f3, he was going to defend the knight with f5. Now we did say about how you shouldn't play reckless pawn moves, but this isn't a reckless pawn move. It's a very strong move, and it gets his pawn majority moving. Here we see these pawns are very mobile, and they're going to try and come forward. Now white decided that this square on e5 was a little bit of a weakness, and he thought he could charge his king into there. Had Sergei calculated against this? Well, we will never know, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say he had. And after king f4, king e7, king e5, he now came up with a very nice plan here. And that was to play knight f6. Now, I just said a moment ago how he doesn't really want to move that knight away. But black has a very large threat here in this position. And the point is that if white now plays knight d2, amazingly black can try and set up a checkmating net with g5, taking away this key square on f4. And now, can you see the checkmating move that black would like to play here? It is, of course, knight d7. So the knight actually retreated in order to gain this idea of this checkmating threat. Very unusual in a knight endgame, especially with a king on e5 like this. But it just goes to show how flexible, again, Karjakin was with his play. And white has to be very careful. In fact, his only move is d5. But black can take on d5. White takes on c4, and black wins a pawn on c3. A pawn up, of course, in endgame is quite a vital thing. So although there's, again, some work to be done, the chances are that Karjakin will be able to convert this position. So his opponent decided after knight f6 that, I better run back, and he decided to go king f4. And now, after g5 check, king f3, he played knight e4 again. Can we compare this position to the starting position? Well, it appears that white has done absolutely nothing apart from walk his king forward and then all the way back again. But black has gained these really nice moves with f5 and g5. And they're not really weakening because black's pawn majority is there, as we said, and he's now gaining space. We still have this issue with the knight on b1. Where is it going to go to? Because if he ever plays knight a3, targeting the pawn on c4, he actually ends up losing 2 pawns because black can take on c3 and then on a2. Very similar to the last variation we just looked at. So in the game he played g3, but this actually created another weakness because now the knight on e4 looks towards the pawn on g3. So Karjakin decided to try and fix this weaknesses. The point is that you may have heard of the idea of sort of creating two weaknesses in a position, because if your opponent has just one weakness, they could possibly be able to defend it. But if they have two weaknesses, it might be a bit too difficult for them to try and hold on to this. And we see that white has a weakness on c3 already, so Karjakin is just simply trying to create another weakness on g3. And we see that occur in the game. He played h5. And the idea is to try and play g4, and that would just fix that pawn on g3. Can't move anymore. How can white defend it? Well, his king will have to stay on f3 to try and sort of defend that pawn. But then white's king is extremely immobile, and black's king can simply try and walk in somewhere, maybe this way. And we're going to see that a bit later in this game. So white really should now have played g4. And I think this is white's last chance to try and draw, or give the toughest defence in this position. And after the swap, black cannot now do anything with his f-pawn because it needs to defend the knight. So king d6, but now, after the swap, although black has a passed g-pawn, this is can be kept under lock and key by the king on f3 if it hangs around this square. And it's actually very difficult for black to win this position, so really white should have done this. And that's what top players really do. When they're down, the chips are against them, they give the toughest defence, which was unable, Tishin was unable to find this. So after g3, h5, he played king g2, but now we saw g4, and again, this weakness is going to come and haunt white for the rest of the game, because we have all these weaknesses, even potentially these pawns as well are quite weak, and it's just a case of whether black can infiltrate with his king. So h4, I think he could have swapped, but it doesn't change anything. The pawn on g3 is still extremely weak, and the white king has to stay on g2 or h2 to try and defend it. So the king cannot do anything. So after h4, Karjakin correctly brought his king in. And king h2, king d5, king g2. This must have been quite painful for white to simply just be shuffling his king around like this. I think he's just awaiting the breakthrough by Karjakin in this position. And the next move sort of typifies that idea. Karjakin just played a6. He understands the idea that even in a better endgame, you should never ever rush. And that's, again, another mature move by Karjakin. I think this is the third time in the third game of this DVD that I've mentioned this. And that clearly shows his potential, that he's not going to rush any position, even though he knows he's ahead. He simply just says, okay, I can improve my position slightly and see what white can do, because he knows that white actually can't do anything in this position. Can't move his knight on b1, and as we said, the king is just only going to shuffle between these squares. And now knight d6. So the point, I think, of a6 was that if white ever plays, for example, knight a3, he could play knight b5, and the pawn on a6 is actually very useful there. Do we think this pawn endgame is winning for black? Well, whilst the pawn on c3 is not under attack from a knight, I think that black's king is superbly placed here compared to white's king. And the king can charge in this way, or it can run to d3 and go after the c-pawn. And once black wins that c-pawn, he's going to have an extremely powerful pawn on c4. So this position is actually completely lost. King g2, king e4, king f2 defending the pawn on e3, but now king d3 and it's game over. So after a6, white just decided to stay still, king h2, but now after knight d6, the king threatens to come in this way again, so white really only has one move, knight d2, knight b5, and I think white is completely lost, because the only way to protect his pawn on c3 is the super active move knight b1, and now after king e4, it's going to be game over. We'll just quickly go through the remaining moves. a4, knight d6. This is a good square because it protects the pawn on c4, so it prevents white trying any kind of knight a3 to c4 tricks. And now this is going to be game over. King g2, and black wins the pawn, and now black's king will infiltrate in the position, and he wins the c-pawn because the knight moves, black wins the pawn, and he's going to win all the other pawns. So, very impressive play there from Karjakin against a 2400 rated player. He just gave white the principle of two weaknesses. He improved his position, and he sensibly did not rush. And that's the thing you should take away from this endgame.